Welcome back to everyone to No Name Podcast. This is our international series where we invite cybersecurity experts from all over the world to discuss cyber domain of the war, make new connections for Ukrainian InfoSec community, and learn from our colleagues abroad. Our guest today is Kenneth Geers. Dr. Geers is an external communications analyst at Very Good Security, which is a startup that anyone working in fintech knows very well. He served for 20 years in U.S. government, in the Army, the NSA, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and NATO. He also had been a visiting professor at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv in Ukraine for 4 years since 2014. Mr. Geers was the first U.S. representative to the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia, where, among other things, he edited the book Cyber War in Perspective, Russian Aggression Against Ukraine, written back in 2015. So not in 2022, back in 2015. So, Mr. Geers, thank you for all your work, for all your support as well, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and just to help out in any way I can.
You've written a lot of stuff about cyber warfare, and to, I think, surprise of many people, it actually dates way back before it was a mainstream, I would say, right? So probably your first book would be the Virtual Battlefield, Perspectives on Cyber Warfare, which is written back in 2009. So did you think that cyber war is going to look like it does today already back then? Or basically, what was your vision at the time, and did it change?
Right. So it's funny. I was an intelligence analyst in government, U.S. government, for 20 years, from 93 to 2013. And then I've spent about the past 10 years in the private sector doing similar work. In 2001, I went to BlackHat and DEF CON in Las Vegas, and I thought, I'd like to talk about the intelligence side of things. And so in 2003, I actually had my first cyber war talk picked up at BlackHat and DEF CON. And so I talked about, along with a professor who specializes in nuclear affairs, we talked about cyber war. And one of the things we talked about was that it would be societal. It would not just affect the government, but that it would affect people and banks. And before, I guess, people were talking about, social media. The big case study we looked at in 2003 was the Arab-Israeli conflict, and how people were participating, for example, in denial of service attacks by just downloading tools and then letting their computer run them.
Sounds familiar.
Without really knowledge of how the tool works, etc. And so, some things have incredibly evolved over the past, 5 years even, and some things over the past 20 seem to be the same. But small bit of biography, I guess one of the things that for me was huge in 2007, I was the lucky analyst at the Pentagon who they asked to go to Estonia in the spring and write a report on what was happening there. And the funny thing is, I didn't leave for 4 years, right? I went there in 2007 and I left in 2011. And of course, that was also, as so many other case studies we have, related to Russia. And not only related to Russia, but pushing the boundaries of what a computer network operation can do in terms of influencing affairs at the level of international relations. Wired magazine famously called it Web War I, right, in 2007, meaning that it was a cyber attack that was supposed to intimidate or coerce another country into doing something. And so, that idea we're somewhat familiar with now, but in 2007, NATO didn't really want to talk about it. Estonia said, we're under cyber attack, we need help. And in Brussels, they so many people, smart people, but they didn't really, they weren't prepared to talk about a new type of warfare that is hard to understand, that is difficult to respond to, right? So that's a little bit, in answer to your question. I think that for me as an intelligence analyst in government, nobody's going to hire me for my hacker skills or coding skills, but I've written many reports on the what we call attribution, who did it, or what they were after, what the hackers were after, because so many of the early cyber espionage campaigns were just about stealing information. So you had to learn, via search terms and via, where the attacks were, who the bad guy might be, right? And so, all of that was fascinating to see. As the attacks evolved, of course, the buttons that the attackers are trying to push, they get so much more intimate and societal, I think, because if you compare Estonia in 2007 to Ukraine in 2014, 2015 timeframe, there's an enormous difference in terms of the targets and the intimacy of the targets. Estonia was a lot about distributed denial of service attacks and the kind of the ability to take out, a bank or a newspaper prevent people from seeing something in a browser. But in Ukraine, 2013, 14, 15, already cyber attacks were able to reach an individual person. So I'll just stop there and say that some of what I've seen is not only a growth in the desires and the hopes and dreams of an attacker, but the ability to touch someone individually, right, and to take a particular account and try and do something with it. One of the best examples, I think, is in 2022. When the Facebook accounts of Ukrainian officers, were taken over and then used to try and tell a subordinate to do something, to lay down their weapons or to surrender. So I'll stop there and just try and answer your question in a broad.
Absolutely. That's a very broad question indeed. And to your last point, there's been a lot of such cases, both targeted for military personnel, but also just in my own native city, a small provider was hacked, and then SMS messages were sent out that Russia is here to help and stuff like that. And so, go ahead.
We have Alex joining.
Hey, yes, we finally have Alex out of everyone
hey guys.
online. Yeah, the Californian internet infrastructure is the one that kind of didn't work for us as expected. Not the Ukrainian
human factor,
which is great.
The internet is back into the US. I just wanted to ask Kenneth from this just go down like with no respect to our agenda. So can we drill into your personal experience observing all this stuff happening? Because for me, the real deal has started actually in Georgia, because there Russia effectively surpassed the threshold of war, right? What happened before was just some military-ish activity, but still under the definition of cyber war, whatever it is, because no war is happening. You cannot say that cyber war is going in parallel. But in Georgia, it was from one side less efficient, not because the toolkit was the Russian toolkit was less efficient. Russian strategy was worse defined. Nothing really changed in 2 years, but the Georgian dependence on digital services, which was much slower than Estonia, right? So it was effective in Estonia for subjective, for intrinsic reason. Estonians were much more we're using technology in government and in public, in civil critical infrastructure, much more intensive than Georgian did. But then they entered the arena, I mean the cyber divisions or cyber forces of Russia entered the arena of Russian-Ukrainian war. They, in my opinion, did a little bit more, but of the same, right? Maybe much more, but definitely of the same thing, without actually pursuing any coherent strategy from the beginning. So they supported some activities of their forces on the ground, but did not use cyber force to achieve anything on their own, yeah? Anything strategical. Do you think that's because they just don't know how to do it, or do you think that the opinion that cyber just inherently cannot achieve anything strategical is true?
I think that you're speaking of Georgia in 2008 or Ukraine in 2022?
No, I'm just trying to compare what happened to Estonia, to Georgia, and now to Ukraine, and I do not really see the difference. You know, they just do more of the same stuff. They do not progress technologically. They do not show any sign of coherent strategy, right? And they just do it, and they cannot or do not wish or just hold them back from getting to another level, to do something via cyberspace, something big on its own, you know. And I'm trying to figure out what could be the reason for that, because you're obviously much more knowledgeable about what's going on.
Well, for me, I think a couple of really big stories are why we haven't seen some kind of decisive cyber attack.
Yeah,
they may not
exactly.
exist, right?
Okay.
So it's possible that there's no such thing as, a decisive cyber attack. It's just, it's kind of like hoping to win, a war, even with special forces or with electronic warfare, pre-cyber. It's an element of warfare, but it's not going to be decisive. And at the risk of analogizing poorly, I think in Pearl Harbor, you could describe it as a striking success, right, from a Japanese military perspective, and a strategic failure from a Japanese military perspective, right? So the possibility that you would be seduced into striking first via cyber or another way is always there, I think, right? Whether you're in a bar after too many drinks, or you have a powerful cyber tool that you could unleash. So it's possible that cyber attacks are just overstated, and they're overhyped. And so that's one of the stories, I think, of this war. I think
guys know why I do it, because I just have a natural tendency to make people say these things as frequently as possible on our show, because when I'm repeating that all over again, no one is listening to me. So I'm trying to get as many people as possible to support this idea. Thank you very much.
Sure. I think there's another way to put it, and another way to maybe understand it is, and again, I don't want to in any way diminish Ukraine's absolute decisive role in determining its own path and its own future, and having achieved its own successes without anybody's help. But one of the stories, I think, is the evolution of cyber defense over the past 20 years. And that's one element. And another is the relatively strong cohesion of the EU and NATO during this crisis. So if you're sitting in Moscow and you're wondering, where do I launch my cyber weapon? It's been relatively difficult, I think, since February 24th, because you've got an EU/NATO national security understanding that is relatively strong and unified. I think, right? We've got our exceptions, we've got Orban, and we're worried about the Italian elections, and there's so it's not 100%. But again, the example of Finland and Sweden, joining NATO, as well as, not only NATO providing support, but the EU providing cyber support, of a tangible nature to Ukraine. I think it's hard from Moscow's perspective to know where to attack, right? But I think that we have seen tons of, I edited this book in 2015, and then I tried to collect the articles in 2022 that talked about computer network operations in the context of the current conflict. And I do think we see so many examples, right? So that's one of the things I wrote into the 2015 introduction, was that it seemed like each of the authors had 20 authors, right? I think 18 chapters. And so many of them said that there wasn't a decisive cyber attack. But yet in each of the chapters were probably multiple events were explored and discussed, incidents. So we know that I think computer network operations are plentiful, right? There's a lot to look at if you collect them all for analysis. I think probably over the past 20 years too, the digital or the cyber or computer network operations units within militaries, within intelligence organizations, have probably been the fastest growing around the world, right? If you look at three-letter agencies and you look at militaries, and you just looked where the relative spending has gone, I don't want to disrespect, CNO, computer network operations, or cyber war, because I think that planners and strategic thinkers, both the tactical level and decision maker level, I think they get it. They see the value in this because it's extremely art of war, right? When Sun Tzu's writing about winning the conflict before you have to actually shed blood, or defending without knowing where your opponent is going to attack, that sort of thing. They all seem to give a window and an opening to computer network operations, right? In other words, if you look at the US presidential election in 2016, in this case, Russia was able to dramatically affect the course of events, by attacking one political party and releasing documents that were embarrassing to that political party at strategically opportune times during the campaign. Was it decisive in determining the winner of the election? I think we don't know. It's possible.
We can't be sure ever. Yeah.
You can't be sure, right? And so that would be an example, maybe it's possible that was the biggest hack in history, right? If you could successfully, put the wrong person in the White House for 4 years.
by different assessments, it wasn't decisive at all. But don't you think it doesn't really matter? Don't you think that the main reason they actually did it was just signaling? Because the Russian cyber is so free, you know, and defying all constraints and trying to maybe even intentionally to demonstrate to all the strategic adversaries that they are not conforming to any norms and don't have intention to do so. Don't you think that trying to influence the
I would say
elections,
unrestrained.
which is
Applying free to Russia just feels weird.
Sorry?
I would say unrestrained, because applying free to
unrestrained, yeah,
Russia just feels weird.
Exactly. I was trying to find the appropriate word to describe your I know it's not sloppiness. I think it's intentional, you know, just to show off what they can do, and they will do it. Whatever you think they're wrong or right, the UN can agree on cyber norms however they want, but we will attack critical infrastructure, we will harm civilians, we will try to affect your legitimate democratic processes.
Sure. No, I think so. I think all those things have been demonstrated in especially in Ukraine. So in Estonia in 2007, I think, you know, I had a chance to interview, you know, many cybersecurity experts at that time. I wrote a report for the Pentagon in 2007. A number of people described it as an experiment. And use the word signaling, which is, you know, really interesting. I think testing of the waters, testing of constraints. Can they see us? You know, what can they prove? What can they do in response? And of course, the U.S. government has experimented in its own way with, you know, naming the personnel in Russia, in China, in North Korea, and in Iran, naming the units, naming the personnel, and showing their faces, right, on the internet. And that's one of the ways that the United States has retaliated, by saying, we can see you, we know exactly who you are. You know,
however, doesn't seem to work. You know, this kind of deterrence, it may work in other places, in places where governments actually tend to conform to the norms, right? But I think in Russia, China, or North Korea, or Iran, it just doesn't work.
That's right. I think that's correct. One of the things I worry about is a dictatorship, as we see in the Kremlin. It just spirals downward, right? There's nothing positive to offer, right? Either the world or Russia, I think. And so you're constantly surprised by what a trapped cat might do. You know, and we know, you know, what any of us would do, you know, if we, you know, were trapped in a cage, and you know, we would seek to defend ourselves. So it could be that things will get worse, and I think that's, you know, of course, we know from, like, you know, the U.S. perspective. I think there's some fear that, well, maybe more so from an EU perspective, a fear of things getting out of control, and a desire not to, you know, poke the bear, and unnecessarily, you know, and keep things somewhat contained. You know, there's this word containment, you know, in international relations, that, you know, is referring to managing the problem, balancing the problem, without making things worse. You know, and of course, you know, right now, I think, you know, especially maybe in Berlin, you know, that's one of the toughest questions, you know, for you know, the chancellor, I think, in Berlin is, and I think they're going to have to decide, right, on the side of Ukraine, because it's such a clear moral and ethical choice, I think, where we need to place our support, political and financial and military.
It sounds great, but unfortunately, international politics is not always based on morals and ethics. It should
Sure.
also be efficient, right? So this decision should be supported by real action that will make this more decisive. Otherwise, there will be no sense in it. So I'm really much enjoying the discussion, but I think that we have a lot of other topics
Right.
on our agenda today. So Ruslan,
I think,
back
yeah,
to you.
I think one of the big things about kind of Russian cyber and cyber in general is that people build this idealistic idea, you know, that when superpower unleashes like cyber war,
Expectation,
yeah, or expectation, right? When superpower unleashes cyber war, it's, you know, everything goes dark and Ukraine is fully disconnected from the internet and like everything's hacked. You cannot use a single system. And in reality, that's not what they see. And I think the explanations might be simpler than other things, because that's also like cyber is not that special compared to any other domain. And we didn't see such a, you know, obliterating advantage in just conventional warfare. And so the same was in cyber. Like they had some successes. Unfortunately, they had many attacks. Many of them failed. So as a result, it's just a mess that, you know, created during the warfare. And so it's not as ideal of a warfare. It's just one of the domains that plays a role. But basically, your report, or rather the report that you edited on cyber war in perspective, right, back in 2015, it already started after initial invasion by Russia. But back then, they at least tried to hide their, you know, kinetic and I don't know, conventional warfare in Ukraine. And so you would expect that it was more heavily kind of, they would put more stakes on the cyber aspect. So what was your biggest surprise during the time when you kind of analyzed their activities? Was there something unexpected, something surprising?
So one of the things that happened in the publishing of that book was we released it in December of 2015. And most of the authors, I would say, mentioned in their chapters that there had been no dramatic attack that changed the nature of the game. But it was just really a couple of weeks before the Christmas attack of 2015 in Ukraine, right, where the electricity grid in the West had been manipulated. And then in the spring of 2016, when I was living in Kyiv, I don't think I've ever got so many emails from cybersecurity experts around the world wondering if I had any, you know, good friends who could shed light on what had happened. So that truly was the event. You know, it was almost like we published the book about 2 weeks, you know, at NATO. Before the Christmas attack of 2015, Ivano-Frankivsk. And so, you know, there's so many firsts in cyber, right? You know, I was in Estonia in 2007. When the question was Article 5 of NATO's charter, which says, you know, it's all for one and one for all concept and come to the defense of an ally in need. And so, you know, Estonia said, hey, we're under attack. And nobody really wanted to talk about it. And as usual, Estonia was a little bit ahead of its time, right? In terms of digital, it has been for a long time, you know, the highest percentage of, you know, online voting, etc. There's many things that Estonia has done well. including, being the recipient of this nation state sort of attack in 27, which was one of the first, Rubicons, in the war. But of
again,
course, Ukraine.
Wasn't it because simply the battle damage assessment of Estonian incident did not result in accepting this as a surpassing of threshold of military action, and which naturally did not lead to any escalation, and maybe some covert action has happened, but we just don't know, because when the US, the UK, and NATO, and Israel, for that matter, do that, we realize that it ever happened a couple of decades afterwards. Could it be the case that the retaliation was applied, but we just don't know?
Yeah, of course. And that's, when it comes to, I think, cyber arms control and deterrence in this space, it's really interesting. A couple of times, the United States has said, we will respond to this cyber attack. For example, in the Sony case, North Korea, we will respond in a time and place of our choosing. And there was a time in which shortly thereafter, in which North Korea was knocked off the internet.
Yeah.
So for sure, the space has all kinds of opportunity for experimentation, for signaling, testing the waters, etc. But for deterrence to work, it really needs to be visible, right? So you want, another oil tycoon in Moscow has jumped out of a window, right? You want people to see and to fear, right? In other words, if nobody knows how you responded, then nobody will believe you actually responded.
Yeah, got to demonstrate the capabilities.
Yeah, I have to remember about the internal politics stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So there, sometimes it's for the world to see, and I think sometimes with cyber attacks too, it could be that if it's in the news, there may have been a calculation that was desirable, right, for a demonstration purpose, because there's probably, for every one computer network operation you see, there may be X number that are unseen, and that's really interesting, right? To know that in general, you probably want to keep your stealth and surprise in this space. But when it comes to warfare, and so there's going to be 1,000 PhDs written on the cyber aspect of the current war in Ukraine, in part because there's a hot war going on, a real war. The attackers they have less of a desire maybe to retain their anonymity, but also less of an ability to, right? The operational tempo is just too high, and the pressures are too strong to spend the time to hide, right? In the net, you have to try and accomplish some goal quickly, or update your malware too fast, right? At this time, because you have somebody telling you, we need this done today. And so that's going to provide a lot of, I've done some sort of data science on very large malware sets. And so if there's an event like an election, I took actually the couple of summits that Trump had in Finland with Putin and in Singapore with Kim Jong-un. And I collected a bunch of malware locally gathered around on site in Singapore and in Finland. And so the quantity and the complexity of the malware was very interesting when you have cases like that. One study I did, when they, I think this was in maybe 17 or 18, when the Ukrainian ship was seized and the sailors seized as well.
Mhm.
So what I did, because that was a kind of it was an event that was sudden and unexpected, right? So then I went and I collected a bunch of malware in Ukraine and Russia during that period. And there was a wealth of things to look at. You could plot it on a heat map from, whatever time of day. I think it was maybe in the morning when the event happened. And so you could see the cyber spies jumping in quickly to try and gather information. And they would be coming from, a couple of dozen countries, I think. But with a large malware sets, you can absolutely see the response to international relations. Anything geopolitical is a magnet for malware. That's for sure. And so in Ukraine today, I think the pressures for Russian hackers to achieve some result is going to be high enough. They're going to make a lot of mistakes, or they're not going to be able to hide, right? And we've seen it in terms of attribution in this conflict. Microsoft and the U.S. government have very quickly come out and said it's Russian GRU hackers, right, that are responsible for this. And so the political desire as well. A lot of attribution is just, do you want to state what you know politically? Because there's an element in which the technical piece may be done, but do you want to burn your sources and methods, or
that's exactly what bring us back to why we don't see more of it, more of new and interesting stuff. Do you think that in their attempts to maintain high operational tempo, they may have burned all the presence they had in the infrastructures, and we can assume that until this point we basically saw everything? Or just from the other point of view, it could be quite the opposite, that they just hold back the presence they have, right? And we are not seeing a lot of event-based operations, a lot of impact, actual offensive actions, because they are trying to maintain the presence in the critical infrastructure just to be sure that they still have the opportunity to apply effect in the future. Which one of those two strategies you think is more plausible?
I think the first, because things have gone really poorly for Russia. I think from a strategic perspective, and now I think they have run out of ideas in a tactical sense as well. So there's going to be incredible pressure, I think, on on Russian officers that are on the ground in Ukraine, but also Russian hackers that are supposed to have some results in cyberspace. The pressure is going to be incredible. So I don't really see why they would be holding back at this point, because all eyes are going to be on them.
And another thing, and sorry for jumping in to answer a question instead of asking, but I think also another thing is that pretty much every Ukrainian cybersecurity company jumped in to help, and also a lot of our partners across the board. So even if they have some capability hidden somewhere, right, every single hour there is more and more likelihood of it being discovered and not used at all. So it would make sense for them to use it all at once while they still can.
It doesn't really make much sense, but it sounds very optimistic, so you get me on board. But as we mentioned, the broad support of the general public and the cybersecurity companies, Kenneth, what do you think is going on in Russia regarding this? So do we see a lot of privatization of cyber ops? Because developing the toolkits, right, the actual cyber weapons, it's well known that basically all the successful Russian companies in one way or another contribute to the capabilities of Russian cyber operatives. I mean, like state-sponsored officers of GRU, FSB, SVR, etc. But do you think they might be tempted to use private companies not only to develop the software and weaponize exploits, but actually conduct cyber operations? Because there is some evidence in open sources that some of the Russian cybersecurity companies are already doing that. What's your point on this? Without any speculation, if you have anything to say, please go on. If not,
I think that the world has a real problem with dictatorship and autocracy, I think. And I can speak as an American as well. I'm really worried about this situation in the United States. I mean, I think we need to really be thinking about how to strengthen democracy and how to restrain our autocratic tendencies or our vulnerability to strongman rule. We've got it as much as anybody, it looks like to me. But I think that dictatorships, I think, also have incredible vulnerabilities, right? Paranoia, I think, and control that is obsessive and will ultimately lead to the downfall of the dictator. The problem is
of expertise, right? So positive selection based on loyalty, not the capability.
Absolutely,
right?
That's right. That's part of it. And a incredible fear and a lack of trust, right? So one of the things we need, like for example, in the United States, is trust in law enforcement, trust in intelligence. But we've recently had an autocratic ruler who was doing everything he could to chip away, right, at trust, because he didn't want
he still might have in 2024.
And so dictators don't want you to they distrust expertise, they distrust independence, peer review. Like in academia, you're supposed to write a paper and then pass it around to friends and they critique it, and dictators are terrified of that, so they don't do it. And then it leads to poor decision making. So I think, just like, when Stalin refused to, believe intelligence officers who were telling him, that Hitler was going to invade the Soviet Union, right? Dictators and autocrats, they're going to wind up in a negative cycle, right, of decision making that is ultimately self-destructive. We hope, sooner rather than later. So in 2020 in Belarus, I think, when we were all hoping that in Minsk they would have a successful, successor to Maidan, right, and force Lukashenko to Siberia. I think maybe, it was close, I think, but ultimately put down through torture and violence and, brutal methods. That's one thing I'd like to say about Ukraine is that what a story, what an incredibly positive story that, how many businesses fail, how many would-be revolutions fail. But yet, in 2014, I think, the Ukrainians stood up and said no, and it was successful, and it's incredible. What an incredible story. So I think that a dictator like Putin has a lot of trouble with successful attack because a successful attack requires a strategic, calculation that has taken everything into account. But
The
dictators
subjective,
can't.
not detached from reality. Yeah.
Yeah, dictators, they're detached from reality. They also have only a menu of bad options, right? So
No, but they have some options. They can say, okay, give me some cyber. I do not expect from Putin or from his close decision-making entourage to understand anything about cyber, right? The guy doesn't own a computer or a smartphone, right? So he says, cyber, in his imagination, cyber is something you can do like spy style, right? So I go to my intelligence officers and say, give me cyber. They say, okay, we got some cyber, we will give it to you. That's the Grook's approach to things. Yes, so it's from his words. This is how they operate. They think that cyber is something tangible, and we can get some.
Pour me
Give
some
me
cyber.
Give me cyber once. Give me cyber two times, 3 times, 4 times. We are out of cyber. What can we do? Okay, we have cyber companies. Let's go to them and ask them to give us some cyber. I think that's exactly what's happening. I'm just trying to maybe get some confirmation, or more importantly, if that's a delusion, if that's nothing close to what's happening, to get some counter arguments and not to be delusional anymore, because the brain drain from Russia is obvious. Like thousands of capable people are just leaking, right? They run for life. And good for them, okay? But there are still some people left, and some of them cannot leave for different reasons, and some of them are good in cyber, right? So
sure.
why not mobilize them and use private sector cyber for public purposes? Do you think something similar is happening, or they are not at that level of understanding even?
Well, I think it must be happening. It's only logical. But yet, I do think the limitations of dictatorship and autocracy are clear, right?
One won't be able to apply it efficiently anyway.
Exactly. There'll be a strategic failure that cannot be anticipated. And some people, I imagine, within dictatorships, they are actively, just like Winston Smith in 1984, they're going to be working against Putin, right? Because they are going to think this is bad for my country, and they're hoping for better for Russia, I think. And so, and the talent will be younger, the talent will be more educated, right? And so criminals,
more prone to
terrorists, and
sabotage.
assassins, they're probably not the best coders or hackers, right?
Yeah.
So there will be some, of course. It's a big country, but the kind of trust and the kind of investment that's required for a successful strategic enterprise, it's not going to be there.
Okay.
Of course, Russia is such a big country. I'm sorry?
Good to hear.
Yeah, of course, Russia is such a big country. We still all have to worry. It's a bear, and of course, in the case of China, it's a dragon. But I would think that the China, Taiwan, China, looking at what has happened in Ukraine, I would think that it's possible that they've drawn the wrong conclusions and that they might need to pull the trigger sooner rather than later. But I would think that in Beijing, they are also correctly seeing this as a failure. And the response has been, I think, strong from the
surprising.
world.
It's surprising for me to hear, because my impression was that Putin's analysts just have stolen what China, People's Republic of China, might have in their files about how they will quickly and decisively invade Taiwan, right? And just applied that plan, that file, to the wrong place and wrong time, trying to decisively and quickly get control of Ukraine and put it as fait accompli in front of the international community, and it is over. It's already too late to react. And you are saying that maybe China will observe what's going on between Russia and Ukraine and reshape its strategy and be drawn into forceful reclamation of Taiwan.
Well, if they
than
drew the
later.
right, if they drew, I think if
they drew the right conclusions,
if
they
drew the right
won't be
conclusion,
able.
but
They won't be
dictatorships
doing it
don't.
anytime soon.
Yeah, but dictatorships don't. I mean,
Oh,
you know, I also think that the Kremlin, you know, has a country that, you know, is twice as large as any other country, full of natural resources, and could be a very wealthy country if it were well managed, right? But
We
it's
should
not
have
well
a
managed,
war.
right? Exactly. So
In
instead they choose
history.
war. So it could be that in Beijing they also choose war, despite overwhelming evidence that it will be a costly misadventure, you know, for the army, for the navy, and for the country. It could be that you know, a dictator only, you know, doesn't see a you know, a positive strategy as being helpful to them personally, right? And so has to only choose a bad strategy, or a strategy filled with, you know, death and destruction.
I think also, even though many Western countries, until recently at least, kind of maybe consider Ukraine a little bit like satellite of Russia or whatnot, with Taiwan, I think it's even more ambiguous for many countries, like the status and what happened there, and that's something that's like not very good for Taiwan and kind of plays in China's favor. But let's get back to Ukraine. So this year at DEF CON, you presented your paper on computer hacks in the Russia-Ukraine war, right? And first of all, that's a very great read and a very comprehensive report of various attacks that I think all of our readers should read too, our listeners should read too. But I think a lot is going on, you know, since February 24th. And like we discussed before, it's not that Ukraine went black and completely failed to defend. Actually, quite the opposite. Many industry leaders, and recently including the head of GCHQ, kind of they announced that, you know, Ukraine might be the best country to defend their networks and to defend against cyber attacks, which, you know, Ukraine never had this reputation of being a strong defender against cyber. So what was that surprising to you, or did you expect that? And also, why do you think that happened the way it did?
So when I was in government I was at the Pentagon for 20 years, between 93 and 2013. And I had I did 4 years at NATO as well. And then, because I'll tell you, in the 90s, my job, I was an intelligence analyst, but I had a Russian language and a French language training in government. So I had 2 languages, and that led me to Europe for studies and for work. I studied Russian in St. Petersburg in the 90s, back when things were better. And that was on a government to government, you know, a training program. So I have always said, well, one of the things that I tried to, when I got back to Washington, I always thought, well, let me try to bring something back, right? Something useful and interesting. And some of the things I used to say is, you know, if you want to understand Russia, you have to either go to Russia, or failing that, you know, go to Finland, go to Estonia. This was a little bit before days when I think, again, people in Washington thought a lot about Ukraine, unfortunately. But I had, you know, connections. I got to do some business trips in not only Russia, but Finland and Estonia and Poland. And I used to tell people in Washington, you got to get over there. Talk to people who speak the language, who have Soviet or Warsaw Pact experience, whose country borders Russia. I'll tell you, a few years ago, I got invited to give a keynote at the Latvian CERT conference, the Computer Emergency Response Team. So we had a video chat like this with sort of their board. And I said, what do you want me to talk about? And all of them in unison said, Russia. Right. And so I said, okay, well, that's easy. That's
what don't you know about Russia?
No, exactly. No, exactly. If you're looking at me from my perspective, it's actually the Americans, who have only to gain, right? And so when I see in the newspaper that the Americans are going to help the Ukrainians, or the Americans are going to help the Estonians, I usually, one of the first things I think is the other way around, right? It's Americans are in desperate need of the kind of expertise you only get by growing up in Ukraine, or growing up, in the former Soviet Union, or growing up in Finland, where this is your area of expertise. Because again, I don't know if you heard this famous Sarah Palin comment. She's from Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I understand Russia because I can see Russia off my front porch. Which is not entirely true. But of course,
not exactly that part of Russia you need to understand.
Exactly. But anyway, the point is well taken. I think in that if you want to understand something, in America, it's not that easy.
You're absolutely right, because very late in my life, I started to read some historic books of Western authors. It surprised me really strongly, like how well Anne Applebaum understands what's been going on behind Iron Curtain in Warsaw Pact countries and in Russia. But then I learned that she spent 20-something years being married to Polish politician and actually living in Poland, and it all just came naturally. You have to have first-hand experience.
Yeah. So anyway, the United States only has to gain from working with Ukraine, right? And what little expertise we can bring to bear. I think, let's say vis-a-vis the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we have to be very humble and realistic about what we can offer. That said, of course, I think there is huge success story currently in terms of collaboration, cooperation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's Microsoft or Amazon or Starlink. These are stories, that are incredibly important in the current struggle.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the power of collaboration, the power of unanimity in the face of, let's call it evil. It is when it's an unprovoked invasion. In my opinion, it's there's no justification. It's only power. It's only violence and aggression in support of dictatorship and theft and criminality. That's absolutely what I believe. And I think we've seen in the response, countries even far away coming to support Ukraine. And Ukrainians' desire, their understanding of what's happening, and their resolute, steadfast defense of their country, has been an inspiration for all of us, for sure. So I think that it's not only Ukraine. It's a story of improvement in cyber defense. It's a story of collaboration. And a desire and the necessity to choose as well. That's why I'm really watching closely what happens in Paris and Berlin, I think, because they need to make the right choices in this tough time, I think. But with Finland and Sweden basically saying, hey, we've been on the fence for decades, but everything changed on February 24th. So we have to make this decision that we really wanted to make anyway, but we were afraid to make. We believed Russian propaganda, or, we were afraid of losing our independence, losing our unique national characteristics. Well, in the face of such unprovoked violence, I think that, people need to, or people will often be forced to make a choice that they know is correct anyway. They were afraid to articulate it.
I think to sum it up, I guess you could also say that the key to kind of successful defense of Ukraine was first kind of understanding the threat correctly, and expecting the right things from the threat, being prepared for it in terms of at least like even just mental state, right, and kind of understanding Russia, so to speak, as you said, as well as cooperation with pretty much the entire world to defend. So even if we didn't have like technological advancements, just the sheer effort of people and cooperation, kind of in unity that everyone started acting in, is something that kind of helped us defend. Is that right?
But technology as well, as you stated in the paper, the advancement in defense that's been going on during the last decade, it's evident, right? So first, resilience has improved because now you can build more reliable systems just simply because public cloud is much more difficult to put down using a cyber attack, right? So if your architecture is right, you will be more or less resilient. And second, the time of response has improved pretty much recently, but still it has, right? So IOCs are exchanged almost in real time. You just need to have the right social network of firsts and thirds and all the other commercial providers, and you will have good chances to withstand even a very serious attack.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Another country I lived in was in Luxembourg, right? And they've got about 300 regular army troops in Luxembourg. But because of the banking sector, they would have many times that in terms of IT security experts, right? And so that's really interesting, because then countries like Iceland and Estonia and small countries that, they play an outsized role in cybersecurity. And so, this is
because
Georgia as well.
Don't you think it's because they have to balance this asymmetry in force? They don't have conventional force, so that's why they are naturally drawn to conclude that improving cyber component will do them well?
For sure. I think it's a focused mind as well, in the face of, I went to a Finnish military conference many years ago. So I asked the colonel, I said, how much of your focus and time and attention is on Russia? And he was on stage, right? He said, 100, right?
Yeah.
And so that was, I'll never forget that comment, because then everybody laughs. It was a huge group of American military officers that were there kind of for a joint, conference with the Finns. Another thing is the size in Estonia. So in 2007, Estonia got all of these applause from around the world for having successfully understood the DDoS attacks and filtered the bad traffic and kept its institutions online. And so, back then they, all these, experts were coming in, and I got to be the lucky, US guy there that, was facilitating some of this dialogue. And a lot of the Estonian response, they say, how are you able to do it? How are you able to defend your country? And so often the Estonians said, sauna, right? So, Vanya, right? we know each
Okay.
other because we sit in a 100-degree sauna,
Team
drinking
building.
together every
Yeah.
week. All the cyber experts of Estonia, they get together and they go into the room where there's no electronic devices allowed, right? And so you have to be transparent and forthright, right, in your discussion.
Don't underestimate the power of social connections, especially when
Exactly.
all people are naked.
Exactly. And so, that's another story, from my, cybersecurity, past, which is, Estonia say, hey, if you want to know cybersecurity, you got to come to sauna with us. And the Americans were like, we've never been in a sauna before. That sounds scary. And so we're
They have the
missing out,
same.
right?
They have the same thing in Russia. Yeah. Why there are not so many successful Russian politicians? I mean, female ones, because they cannot go to Bana.
Exactly. Right. So the country is too big, though. I think in part what the Estonians were saying is the size of their country is a benefit in cybersecurity. All the experts know each other. They know whom to call. And like you said, back then, today it might be quicker to get IOCs. Back then, it was probably harder.
Yeah. Definitely.
I know we're running a little bit over, but if time permits, I would like to cover just like two more small things. So one is obviously there's been a lot of effort to defend, but also we had a lot of hacktivists, a lot of things going on, where Ukraine tries to show a little bit of offense towards Russia as well, and we have our groups of hacktivists, so to speak. So was there something surprising or impressive to you as they acted, and some of their maybe successes or whatever we can talk about publicly?
Yeah, so there's, as an analyst, and especially an open source analysis like this is necessarily incomplete. And I think even if you're on the deep undercover work, you also, one of the ironies is you're also kind of looking at the world through a straw. So even if you're at a 3-letter agency, you might be so focused on some element of the conflict that you miss the bigger picture. There's two things or two incidents or attacks in the paper that I suggest may have been the biggest hack of the war. And so one is pro-Russia and one is pro-Ukraine, and I don't know that this is correct. It's just a feeling you get from reading a bunch of analyses and thinking about it. So the Viasat attack, right at the beginning of the war, clearly the timing of it and the loss of comms, at the outset of the war, is definitely something that will be studied by militaries and intelligence agencies around the world as much as they can, to understand how a military, what a military would do just prior to an invasion, just prior to the onset of war. And so according to the Ukrainian government, I think it was an immediate and significant impact on operations, right? And then there was the collateral damage as well elsewhere in Europe that seems to indicate that the Russians were happy to see collateral damage as a result of the operation. It was that important, essentially. Mm-hmm. And then the other one was in Belarus, the Belarusian partisans and the railroad hacks that again were at the very beginning of the war. And Washington Post has a long article on this topic in which the author suggests that it contributed to chaos at the start of the war from the Russian side. The inability to move troops and material effectively and efficiently through Belarus may have contributed to the 40-mile convoy that is so infamous that we're sitting ducks. Those are a couple of potentially computer network operations that were that at least will be dissected in detail by intelligence agencies and militaries to understand, were they real, were they effective? Because I think we know now that the Russians wanted to take Ukraine very quickly, and that failed. So what were the most important factors that contributed to the strategic failure of the Russian plan? It could be that it was going to fail anyway. But from a hacker perspective, that initial assault on Kyiv, from the north, and from the area of Kharkiv, to the northeast, my guess is that hackers, pro-Ukraine hackers, were engaged in maybe hundreds or thousands of operations to slow down the Russian invasion, and to help to defend Ukraine, to defend Kyiv, defend Zelensky at the outset of the war. And again, a little bit like the 2016 election in Washington, was the hack successful? It could be impossible to say. We may not ever know. But again, there'll be 1,000 PhDs written on the battle for Kyiv at the beginning of the war, the decision of Zelensky to stay and defend the country. That was huge. That was incredibly powerful statement. For me, I gave a couple of talks on Ukraine to a couple of conferences some months ago, and I kind of ended with the picture of Zelensky and his closest advisors there. In the days after the invasion, when they came out and Zelensky said, "I am here, ministers here, we are defending the country, we're not going anywhere." So it's the connectivity, it's the reach of, information power, information operations, not only within Ukraine, but around the world. Like Zelensky has been a genius, I think, visually and in terms of what he says to the Knesset in Israel, or to in Germany and France and in Washington. He speaks to foreign governments in languages that they can understand. He's a genius, and so his decision to stay in Kyiv, and the incredible success story, I think, of defending the capital against the Russian attack in the first couple of weeks of the war, are incredible. And I would think that, from our perspective, from the cyber perspective or the hacker perspective, the element of the defense of Kyiv that was cyber, that was computer network operations, is key, I think, at least to understand it, right? And so I would think that three-letter agencies in, several dozen countries have,
We'll be studying it.
Will be studying it in great detail, right? And
especially because both attacks that you highlighted are actual cyber warfare network operations, right? Because they are well aligned with the operational activity on the ground, and they maintain certain level of support to what's going on in other domains. So by definition, this is cyber war, right? So I do not like the term, but if anything is cyber warfare, that's not beta. That's this stuff, key ASAT, and presumably what's been going on in Belarus and its railway.
Presumably.
Right.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think the last thing that I would be super interested to ask is, since Taras Shevchenko is actually my grandma's alma mater, I was wondering, what was the experience there like? What did you talk there about? And basically, what was your impression from the people?
So sometimes in life you have to take, just speaking from a personal perspective, so one door closed and two open, right? So I was working for FireEye at the time, and they said, I was going to move to Kyiv in 2014, and they said, okay, no problem. But then they gave it to the lawyers, and the lawyers said, no, I have to move to
Oh,
Poland,
I remember that
right?
story. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's fine. So, well,
It's
you just have to think, how can I
insurance or
take
what?
advantage
It is due
of
to
the
insurance,
situation?
right? Corporate
Yeah,
situation.
yeah. I mean, you give it to lawyers, and they're going to say, no, that's
It's too
something bad
risky.
is going to happen. So what one of my bosses at FireEye said, the lawyer said that it's a country at war, and this was 2014.
Yeah.
So anyway, I did other things that were ultimately more fulfilling. I worked with the authors to do the book on. Post-Maidan, there was a lot of cyber attacks to think about, and so we did a book on the topic. And then I got to know some professors at the university, chiefly in the legal faculty. But I just started talking to them about doing a class on cybersecurity, and I did do a Ph.D. in Estonia while I was there, because I was there for 4 years, and the way they've designed the NATO Cyber Centre there. And the Ukrainian flag is up at the Cyber Center, by the way, just to make sure everybody knows that. The Estonia is a vocal.
We're lucky to have some of the partners that we have.
Yeah, and so one of the things, if you go to the Cyber Center, if anybody listening to this podcast, one of the first things they'll ask you, and I got to be the first. I was the first actually international researcher posted there in 2007. They'll ask you, do you want to do a PhD? And then they'll put you in like Tallinn Technical University. And then during your tour there, you'll also go to the university and do classes and you'll write a dissertation. So I really wanted from a personal perspective, the ability to teach. I didn't care at what level, could be kindergarten or college level. But I was so lucky, we lived downtown, and I could walk over to the university. Two of my favorite things to do in Kyiv are the opera and go to the university. And so yeah, I got to teach a class on cybersecurity for 2.5 years. Even when I lived in Canada, I taught at least one semester into 2017. And and I tried to evolve the topic. The cybersecurity is one of those things, as our listeners will know, it's a big topic that it's kind of like international relations, or, what is IR? It's a bit of history and a bit of politics and a bit of military, a bit of diplomacy and a bit of intelligence. You have to, you think about a broad array of topics, and so with cybersecurity. But you bring in, you try to bring in the hacks, right? Computer hacks. And so I know, for example, DEF CON, they're very allergic to the word cyber, right? They don't like it. But I've been able to get fully 9 talks through the system there, the process, by trying to tie computer hacking to intelligence, to politics. I did it to human rights, Arab-Israeli conflict, stuff like that, right? And so I always look at it through the lens of an intelligence analyst. What would the White House be interested in today? And part of that, we talked earlier about, give me a bit of cyber. I think that has probably also come a long way. I think maybe some smart leaders get it, but they probably live in places
some
like
people
Estonia.
had more time, more time to learn that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, some countries, I think, like Estonia or Finland or something, they inherently get it a little bit better. Zelensky, I think, is one of the takeaways from the current conflict, is that the information operations sometimes can blow a cyber operation or computer network operation away.
Is one of the
Right.
conclusions in your paper. Yeah, information ops.
I think connectivity and the the ability to the reach of keeping online. And that's a story, of course, of the current conflict as well. One would think that Ukraine would be offline, right?
Yeah.
If
what I
Russia
thought.
invade a country, then they're going to knock it offline first.
Mhm.
But that absolutely hasn't happened. And I think in first and foremost, because, of Ukraine's defense of its own country. But it's nice to have, EU and NATO and IT firms and IT security firms that are also supporting you. I think it's a story. And this as well, I think that cyberspace, and I think by extension, cybersecurity and cyber defense, I think they're much more democratic than they are autocratic, right?
Yeah.
So dictators, they can point a gun at a hacker's head and say, steal me some money, right, from a bank, and that'll work. Of course, it works, but it's not a strategic plan. It's not a plan for a country. And in that sense, I think that we've seen the exodus of scientists and writers and artists from Russia, right? This is not a news story either. This has been going on for 150 years, because of repression and a lack of, human rights and press freedom, etc. And Ukraine has positioned itself as the antithesis of that, right? And so I think we are going to see, an incredible amount of investment in Ukraine in the near to medium and long term, because now Ukraine is synonymous, with standing up for, freedom and standing up for independence, right? And that's, and it's not the outside players. I think it is absolutely Ukraine that is defending its own nation and its own people and its own land. But I think people are going to want to invest in that, both today and in the future.
Mr. Geers, thank you so much for first of all for your words, but also for your time. It's been super interesting. I guess usually when we wrap it up, we just ask about whether you have any message or advice to to our Ukrainian audience.
Yeah, it's you're an inspiration, I think, to the world, and you will absolutely continue to be an inspiration because of the threat posed by a dictator, right, is real, and you know it better than I do. So I think that any advice I have for you is not something that you don't already know, right? I am seeking to learn from Ukraine, and I think the West should be seeking to learn from Ukraine. And so we can only do that, though, I think, with collaboration and with communication. And so I think that anything you need from me, please let me know. I'm kind of easy to find, I think, in cyberspace. But I look forward to personally supporting Ukraine and coming there again very soon. And I hope that anything that I could offer you, I would rather learn from you. So let's continue in communication and collaboration. And that's
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We hugely appreciate it. And I would say that Mr. Geers is one of the people who doesn't just support with words, but also like all your work is just a Klondike for any kind of Ukrainian cyber professional. Like I highly recommend reading all the reports and articles and books written by it, because like it's really a Klondike. So thank you so much for all your work as well.
We do have a question from audience. So Kenneth, if you have like 2 minutes.
Of course.
I think like this is actually one of the topics that we didn't cover, so Alex is asking, it's interesting to hear your opinion about development of Ukrainian e-services and e-government in the last years. So pretty much, I guess, before the war. So do you think like we were similarly effective or less effective, or something that could be done, I guess, right? Or yeah.
Well, so when I lived in Ukraine, I had the opportunity a few times to go to meetings where people would ask for my advice. And fortunately, I had moved to Ukraine from Estonia. So I often said that go talk to the Estonians, and the Estonians they want to help, and they want to export as well, things like X-Road, their online government products and services.
Mhm.
And then Estonia, of course, couldn't do it without international collaboration. So I remember once when I was there, went to a briefing on how all of Estonia was backed up in England, right? Government services. And so as Vlad mentioned earlier, I think the cloud has been hugely helpful, right, in helping Ukraine and other countries to remain online and to remain reliable, right? So so what gives money, what gives government its credibility, its legitimacy is belief, right? And so you need for people to feel the reliability, and the another thing the Estonians have done well is to try and use IT tools to chip away at corruption, right? So I can say in the United States, we really need this as well. We need to use more transparency and digital tools to, for example, with blockchain, you can do pretty cool things with taxes and salaries and government payments and stuff. You can make them more public and transparent. These are the kinds of things that, whether you're in Ukraine or the United States, or hopefully not too long in the future, Russia, take advantage of these tools. And it's the connectivity and the reliability as well. So I think that Ukrainian government, again, it's this investment in things that we know that work, and things that we see as beneficial, right? And so I think that Ukraine is such a point in history that these decisions that it makes are so visible, right? Everybody's watching, and everybody's interested. And so it's the perfect time to kind of make the right decisions and to make investments that inspire, and investments that foster credibility and transparency and legitimacy. And so, yeah, all eyes are on Ukraine. And I would say that you can benefit from that. You can take advantage of that, especially with someone like Zelensky sort of being the spokesman for the country. It's incredibly valuable to have a voice. And of course, Zelensky is going to represent the Ukrainian government. Just a person, but really powerful voice, incredibly influential and compelling voice. But beneath that, of course, investing in the kinds of things that will foster, I think, belief and when Ukrainian citizens look to its government, what they want to see, I think, is more, just like anywhere else in the world, more transparency, more clarity, more reliability. These are things that everybody wants. I mean, because we all think about our families ultimately, and we want better schools, we want better infrastructure, we want better healthcare. I think that's true in Russia and Ukraine and the United States. And it's so easy though to get trapped in political games. But that's what we need to, I think, all of us be focused on, right? Is how to improve civil society, democracy, etc. And cyber, of course, can play a huge role in that effort.
Right, and I think, like, to be fair, a lot of InfoSec professionals, especially in Ukraine, are often critical of these efforts, but at the same time, and I used to be pretty conservative on this standpoint as well.
We should
But
go
as-
to
as-
sauna altogether. Yeah, I think like that's one of
Go to
my
sauna.
takeaway from this talk. Yeah.
That's one of the takeaways. But also, as my career grew, I kind of now lean towards security is just one aspect, and it's always about benefits versus risks. And as long as the benefits for the society outweigh the dangers, outweigh the negatives, that's what progress essentially is. That's why we have GPS now, even though it would be safer for the US to never make it available to anyone in the world. So I'm also fairly optimistic in this regard, and hope that we'll use this opportunity to drive Ukraine and also basically all of the world forward. So thanks a lot. It's been super incredible. I'm super thankful for your time, because we did run over, but we covered a lot. So it's super interesting. And just thanks for all your work you do once again. We're super excited to learn more, see the developments, and hopefully after victory we can have another episode that's more detailed on all the interesting, intricate things. So looking forward to that as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure and an honor, and I'm happy to help in any way I can.
Thank
Thank you
very
so
much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.